Hello, everyone, and welcome to Good Tech, an ongoing discussion around ethics and technology. I'm Elizabeth Perry with IDCA. Today, we're going to talk about your digital human rights. What does that mean? What are your rights? How are they being taken away or compromised? And how can we as consumers and users take back those rights and still benefit from the various services and channels online? Joining me today is someone whose work centers around the protection of digital human rights and data empowerment. Please welcome from Helsinki, General Manager of MyData Global, Teemu Ropponen. Hey, Teemu, it's a pleasure to have you with us today. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
All right. And so let's get right into it. Tell us about your work at MyData. What's the mission of MyData?
So MyData, in essence, we talk about the right of us as individuals to control our personal data, the right of us to see how that data is used and have the ways and means to control that. And in essence, we're looking at, yes, our digital rights and our human rights, but at the same time realizing and recognizing that personal data absolutely must be needed and must be shared and must be used for the digital services. So it's a combination of digital rights and the industry need for personal data. And now MyData Global, who I work for and which I lead, is a nonprofit that was founded less than a year ago to promote these MyData principles and the MyData thinking across the world.
Great. So, and tell, excuse me, tell me how you got involved with MyData and when and how.
Sure. So originally, I'm from the kind of open data and open democracy field, if you will. And the background of MyData thinking goes back to 2012 when in Helsinki, Finland, we had a huge open data festival. Hans Rosling was there with his very, very fancy, nice talks and inspirational talks about the data and how that transforms the world. And at that festival, we had one tiny session that was about, well, what do the principles of open data, open knowledge, what do those mean from the perspective of personal data and privacy? And since then we've worked on that originally as a kind of a subgroup or a working group of open knowledge, and Open Knowledge Finland in particular. Some years ago, 2014, we wrote a white paper to the Finnish government on a human-centric approach to personal data. What would it mean if us individuals had more control over that data? What would it mean in terms of legal implications, but what would it mean, for example, for technology and business? And once we kind of course, you will understand that a Finnish white paper isn't going to be that exciting for outside of the borders of Finland. We're a very, very small language group. But we wrote a version of that in English the following year, and that got quite a bit of interest. There were some university projects and businesses, obviously, and other communities working on personal data. But this white paper got the interest of, for example, the European Commission and some other people, and clearly some traction was gained and big interest from multiple communities. So we started building and joining these communities around the world who had worked on personal data from slightly similar angles, not necessarily same angles, but similar angles. And starting 2016, we've organized a conference that brings these communities together, brings together companies, brings together nonprofits, governments, activists to work on the topic of personal data and personal data use. And now, just under a year ago, we then founded and kind of spun off into its separate entity, the MyData Global nonprofit, which about 10 months ago, pretty closely we started.
Pretty exciting, a lot of work to do, I'm sure. It seems data breaches and the misuse of data are so commonplace now. It's almost a daily occurrence. Can we talk about that a little bit? Just, how are our rights being taken away? And then I know you want to talk more about the solutions.
Sure. Well, I mean, definitely there's, it's obvious, and it's there in the MyData logo. You see there the kind of 11 different domains that we've put out there, enormous amounts of personal data gathered about us, often with our consent, not necessarily knowing and meaningful consent in that sense, but often with a legal consent. And yes, that data, sure, sometimes breached, sometimes misused in some ways, and sometimes in legal terms maybe used properly, but in our mindset perhaps in dubious ways. And we realize that, for example, the yes, I've read terms of service, one of the biggest lies in human history in some way. Studies show people don't read the terms of service, let alone understand what that really means. So, I mean, yes, the breaches and definitely the Cambridge Analytica and the similar ones we hear almost weekly, raise alarms. But I think maybe even more scary than that sometimes is that we actually consent to stuff that we don't realize we are consenting to.
Yeah, it's very complicated even for us, so-called tech savvy people to really get through that stuff. So that needs to change, I'm sure. And so, go ahead.
We use so many digital services. I mean, it's just cognitively impossible to realize that how are all the different services using our data, for example. It's humanly impossible, no matter what your skills and background really is.
Right. So you talk about a fair and open digital society. Can you just take us through that a little bit? What do you see happening? How can we be open and still protect our right to privacy, for example?
Sure. So, I mean, what we mean by first of all, a fair digital society and a fair data economy is that in essence, right now, the power tends to be monopolized or in the hands of a few. And for example, we really don't have competition in many ways. It's difficult for new companies to fight against the tech giants, for example. Politicians will say that it's impossible for them to be out of platforms like Facebook, for example. So you could say that it's not really a fair digital society. You could argue that yes, that's the way capitalism works, sure, but otherwise you could argue that okay, it's not really a fair competitive environment. It's not, the power symmetry is skewed. And what we mean by open society and open digital society is that just like we talk about open data and open knowledge, data should flow, data that governments have or public services have, be it the temperatures or traffic jam situations, whatever, that should be usable to create innovations on top of. Similarly, personal data needs to be open in the sense that it can be opened and can be consented to reuse in various types of circumstances, but the individual, of course, should be in charge and in control how that data is used, whether it's used, and of course that when you want to stop using or giving that particular personal data.
So, I mean, yeah, and so that means that what you're really saying is that there's more, when there's more data out there, as long as it's open and we are able to control it, that's a good thing. Am I getting that right?
Sure. Maybe that's a little bit straightforward conclusion, but in similar ways, yes. So let me give you an example. So I mean, let's take for example sleeping. How do you sleep? So you might have some kind of a gadget, a ring or a wrist that's tracking your sleep. Perhaps that's nice. You've got the personal data, and you can analyze myself. Now, what might be meaningful is to share that data perhaps with your doctor, or perhaps combine that with some other elements of data to get a more complete view of, let's say, your health. Maybe not just the sleeping, but some other things as well. Or further, using that personal data combined with some open data, for example, relating to like statistical data. How do I compare to the similar population in my country or in my region or my age group or whatever? And the value can be actually added that if I see just my numbers, yes, they might tell me something, but if I see my numbers compared to something else, that might be even more valuable. So that's like one way of where kind of open data and personal data could be shared, or combined in interesting ways to create more value. So these types of dashboards, not just health, but really in pretty much all domains. But that may be a simple example I often use.
No, it's a good example. And, coming from somebody who really doesn't, this is all new to me. So forgive me if I'm asking stupid questions, but I wanted to kind of understand, is this an easy thing to realize, what you're proposing at MyData? Or is it easy to do?
It's that's a great question. It's definitely not easy. So I mean, what we are suggesting is a pretty fundamental shift actually in the way kind of data is controlled. That instead of it being locked in systems and guarded and maintaining our privacy, we as individuals have control over it. Now, of course, the GDPR, the European General Data Protection Regulation, has created a lot of rights and a lot of kind of a movement towards this direction. So in essence, you could say that the MyData thinking builds on top of GDPR in many ways. So I mean, particularly areas like data portability and data access there, which are defined as rights in the GDPR, like MyData kind of points at ways of how to implement those rights in practice. So what that would mean from a technical point of view, instead of just the legalese, if you will. But it will definitely be. I mean, we talk about this with people that, okay, is it a shift? It's a shift that's happening now. Definitely, there's more and more concern about personal data. There are services being made where you can get your data and share that data. But at the same time, it's a marathon, not a sprint. So it'll take probably a couple of decades for this shift to really realize that we as individuals are truly in control the way that we envision it.
Right, that makes sense. Thank you. In a recent blog post I read on MyData, which, by the way, there's some fabulous content on mydata.org. So I encourage the audience to go and take a look at that. But on a recent blog post, you mentioned a term, the privacy paradox. It's a really interesting term. Can you elaborate on that for the audience? What does that mean?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, paradox is a nice word, and in many ways, certainly this area is full of them. I mentioned the terms of service, and yes, I've read the terms of service. That's one paradox example where we really straightforward lie about our behavior. The privacy paradox refers to the fact that we claim in various surveys, we want to behave in smart ways. We want to be, we claim to be concerned about our privacy and sharing our data. Now, unfortunately, in our daily lives, we don't quite do what we claim. So we actually are quite sometimes quite sloppy about sharing our data and thinking about privacy, and that's the paradox here. And I think there's plenty of studies around that.
Yeah, that's interesting too. I know I'm guilty of sometimes just getting annoyed with all of these cookie notices that come up.
Certainly, and it takes quite a bit of discipline, doesn't it? If you really want to look at all of them and control those, and that's kind of exactly why there should be one point of control for that. I mean, you should have one place where you could control about your profile and your preferences instead of doing it differently for every single site, for example.
Right. So let's talk a little bit about the organization, MyData. Who's involved in the MyData community?
Sure. So maybe just separating two things. So I mean, first of all, the MyData community that's brought together these various different types of initiatives, bridging different communities, people who are participating in some of our events and workshops around the world, a couple of thousand people probably. Then MyData Global as a nonprofit, which, like I said, about 10 months ago founded. That's right now about 90 organizations and about 600 individuals, data experts from all around the world. So really from about 40 countries and 6 continents right now, which kind of demonstrates that this personal data is definitely a global issue. It's not a topic. The issues around personal data are not going to get solved in Finland or in Europe or even the North or the West, if you will, but rather it's a global issue. Yes, the perspectives are different, of course, but we are talking about a global phenomenon.
Yeah. And, so go ahead.
And yeah, a little bit about the like what kind of people, what kind of organizations are there and are involved. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of tech companies and tech nonprofits, but it's also definitely not just about technology, which I'm sure we'll get to later on in this discussion. And as members, there are startups, there's established corporations, stock listed corporations, nonprofits working on responsible data, public sector authorities, so all kinds of organizations and people coming from a variety of backgrounds, some from more societal perspective, some from more tech, and definitely then people from business and legal backgrounds.
Let's show that slide, number 24. There's a map. If you can pull that up, Ryan. There you go. There's a map here showing the different places that MyData is present in. Is that an accurate look? So I'm looking at the US and I see, where are you located in the US?
There's a hub in Silicon Valley and one coming up in New York City. Right. So yeah, well, how we operate, I mean, it's like I said, MyData is it's a community that has these what we call hubs or networks or network nodes all across the world. So there's about I think about 21 at the moment. A lot in Europe, which I think is quite natural, but also more and more interest in the US and also in for example in Japan. There's a very vibrant community there, and then some more interesting locations. Greetings to the guys in Cameroon, for example, guys and girls there, making sure that and reminding us not to that it's not just something that the global South should not be taking part in, but rather that the discourse is a global one.
Yeah. So let's talk about BLTs, not the sandwiches, but we were talking about in another blog post. I found it really interesting. BLTs is an acronym for what?
Yeah, so we talk about the BLTS or bacon, lettuce, tomato sandwich as some call it, and basically we talk about like the whole erosion of trust regarding personal data. How do we get past that? And it requires looking at different perspectives. So the business, legal, tech, and society perspectives. It's just tech solutions aren't going to do it. Just passing the GDPR or similar legislation, be it the California privacy laws or whatever, they aren't going to be enough. You need to work on new types of business models. You need to, in general, talk about the societal angles. What's the society we want to live in? And that's why we remember and remind ourselves to think through what we want to do from these different perspectives. So business, legal, tech, and society, the BLTS.
Right. So I wanted to talk about also, again, a blog post. I've been doing my homework here, reading up on you guys. And like I said, good content. So on our last show, we spoke with IDCA co-founder and CEO, Göran Wegström, about the recent Netflix documentary, The Great Hack. And you guys did your work there too, talking about that documentary. It was important to a lot of people. If you haven't seen the interview with Göran, it's worth watching. You can see it on our YouTube channel here or on ubngo.com/goodtech. The movie goes into detail about the Cambridge Analytica scandal and how the data of millions of users was used and privacy was compromised. Let's talk about that for a moment. What was the hack? What do you see as the underlying problem behind this so-called hack the movie's talking about?
Well, I mean, I guess there's been some discussion that what exactly was the hack there. I mean, in essence, what my takeaway from that whole case is that, again, we can talk about whether there was legal permission to use some of that personal data Cambridge Analytica got, and probably there wasn't. But even if there was, people most certainly weren't aware of how their personal data was used and gathered. And people even more certainly weren't aware that based on this data that was gathered, that it was used in such manipulative ways to even perhaps undermine and probably undermine the elections and affecting some of those results. So it's definitely relevant, and one of our board members, Paul Olivier de Hey, is in the film and is in the background, has been quite I think active and fundamental in this case, and also has been heard by the DCMS in the parliamentary committee in the UK. And yeah, the ad industry and the kind of profiling, that's definitely a scary element, and this film is great in bringing up some of the problems. It's a dystopia in many ways, thinking about a future in which our elections are possibly, the results are possibly manipulated, and sometimes we might not even realize it. In this case, luckily, through some fine work by a number of people, and enormous work done by a number of people, we're able to understand that a little bit better. But the whole issue of personal data is much more than just about the advertising industry and about profiling and the like. And we see, I mean, there's a lot of discussion about should personal data be sold, for example, and if advertisers want information about you, should you get compensated for that? And that too is an important discussion, and that needs to be had. But we think that in the MyData community, I think the interesting uses of personal data are when you're mashing up, combining different types of personal data, not only for the use of some marketers and marketing campaigns or the like, but rather in your daily life, combining your health data or your retail data or your energy data or whatever, to give you some insights into how you behave, or to lessen the burden in say using some public services by giving consent from various places to aggregate your data to sign up your kids to school, for example. So I mean, like how personal data sharing can better your personal life, we think is much more interesting and much more valuable than just the advertising. Realizing that, of course, there too is enormous issues and also enormous potentials to be gained.
Yeah, so I'm going to ask a tough question now. Is this even possible? I mean, look at all of the companies that have made vast fortunes, amounts of money on this ad-based economy, on this surveillance economy. I mean, are they going to let just us go ahead and make a shift like this?
Yeah, I think that's the $1 million question. It's definitely a tough one, and that's why I said it's not a thing that's going to happen in a year or 2 or 3. For example, the GDPR points at some right directions in many ways, and then a lot of the big tech companies, although they are using it now as a competitive advantage, originally have tried to slow things down, try to avoid the GDPR. So the hypothesis is that yes, this can be profitable, that people want to. That people do care about their data. People are willing to share their data if they feel that they are getting value for sharing that data. And again, like I said, the lack of trust between people and the services towards the services they use is actually preventing a lot of business from happening place. So businesses need to regain that trust in various ways. And one way to regain this trust is to let users have more control over it, to help users understand how that data is used, and so on. So, for example, again, maybe explaining what I mean by example, we often don't trust, say, the pharma industry, for example. We think that's a great, enormous profits. They want data about us. And then they want to make medicine that costs a ton. And thus we're a little bit reluctant to participate in some medical studies. Well, if I do give that data to medical studies, if I benefit from that data along the way, benefit from maybe again understanding my peer groups or benefit from a better understanding of myself, I may be a little bit more inclined and trustful towards such companies. Or I might be inclined to give information about how I use public transport, how I use buses and subways to the transport companies, if I know that they will create, based on that personal data, they will create better journey planning. They will create better apps and better suggestions for me. So I mean, again, it's a matter of symmetry there.
Mm-hmm.
There's actually recently been done a study by the Finnish innovation agency Sitra on how businesses in Europe, in 4 countries in Europe, see the kind of MyData and personal data potential. Unfortunately, those results are not out at the time of this chat we're having. But they will be at the MyData 2019 conference, and I think there's some interesting results there. And regarding the health, again, for a concrete example, there was a study on health data, and people very positive towards collecting their personal data through gadgets, collecting their through activity wrists and rings and and wearables, for example. But people not gaining enough, only a small percentage of the respondents said that they're getting value out of that data that's being gathered about them. Well, you could look at that from a negative perspective that, oh, people want to gather data and are gathering data, but they're not really using it. Sure, but to me, that's also definitely a potential for business. People's attitude very pro towards collecting and using data on their health.
Yeah, that's interesting because health is a very tough thing right now. I mean, it's very, people think it's dangerous to share that kind of data. And, what are the guarantees? I don't know.
But I mean, sometimes, yeah, when we talk about like this data sharing, I just like to remind that it might also be, you might have the data about you still on your devices or personally stored, not necessarily sharing it between services. But I mean, it might be the data coming from services to you, or it might be, for example, an application or an algorithm processing personal data on your device, for example, depending on the technologies you use. But definitely health data, one that's there's enormous potential, but also one that there's big risks and doubts. And this kind of paradox again makes that for quite an interesting domain.
Yeah. Well, let's go to. I'm going to skip around over here because you've already answered some of my big questions. But let's talk about technology. What are the technologies that are needed for this kind of shift that you're talking about at MyData?
Sure. So I mean, the whole kind of technology stack or the different areas, there's quite a few. So I mean, you might have various user interfaces that you need. You need personal data analytics, possibly personal data stores, and so on. There's a number of technical issues to solve this kind of data flow from one place to another. You need standardized data formats and so on. But one key part of the infrastructure that we propose in the white paper is the idea of a kind of MyData operator. And what we mean by an operator would be for example, one place or a couple of places where you have not necessarily all your information stored, but information about your information. So, for example, the consents you have given, and who's using your data, and what types of data, and this operator could, for example, handle things, your consents, but also things like transferring data from one place to another, converting between kind of file formats or kind of data types and things like this. So I mean, ideally, you would for example have one or a couple of user interfaces that you as an individual use, instead of right now imagining that even if you do have control over your personal data, if you use, let's say, 50 different services, and let's say each of those services has 20 different settings, that means all in all you've got 1,000 settings all over the place regarding your personal data. That's quite impossible to manage. So these MyData operators make that like one bit or several bits simpler. And we call them MyData operators. In the UK, some studies have talked about data facilitators. We talk about data fiduciaries or data banks in Japan. So similar kind of infrastructural elements that are needed to kind of control and handle the aspects of personal data.
Yeah, that's all very interesting, and it sounds like you've got to you're going to be doing some growing. Is that the goal? You're going to be, as an organization, you're going to be growing. Do you have any goals as far as like how big you want to be and what?
Sure. Well, I mean, like I said, it's a global shift, and we need to be in the global discussions. And for example, in the discussions about how do we make those kind of my data parts of the GDPR, how do we make them actionable? How do we make them real? And again, it's a long path. Just a moment before we started discussion, I was thinking about the freedom of information, which is as a concept about 250 years old, and still we're finding like okay, what does freedom of information mean in context XYZ? So you're defining the rules of the game over a couple of centuries. Similarly, there's a ton to be done in the personal data space. So we are right now discussing with companies and other organizations around the world across domains, kind of joining forces to work on this together. And many of the interesting kind of use cases of personal data combine data from, let's say, health combined with, let's say, retail or shopping data. So we need to be able to kind of talk across domains, talk across sectors, not only within, okay, let's agree on certain things in the finance sector or retail sector and the like, but rather there's quite a bit of collaboration to be done for this shift to happen. So yes,
Right.
that pressure on growth and kind of growing the community of organizations working together.
Mm. And you touched on, talk to us a little bit more about what you mean by a formal to actionable rights, that shift that's taking place, and then MyData declaration. Can you
Sure.
talk to the audience a little bit about that?
Sure. So the MyData declaration is a kind of a summary of what the changes that need to be happen for us to have those rights, the rights to control our personal data. And there's three essential big shifts that need to happen. One of these being from formal to actionable rights. And what we mean by this is that, for example, the data protection laws like GDPR and the like, yes, they give us some rights, but in practice, it's quite difficult to exercise those rights. You might need to go through courts or appeals or jump through various types of hurdles to, for example, get your data or to get yourself forgotten or to transfer that data from one place to another. So making them just legal instruments isn't enough. By actionable, we mean that there should be standardized ways how services operate. In the US, you've got the blue button for downloading health data. You've got the green button for energy data. Similarly, there should be similar or simple user interfaces, just like shopping carts in terms of e-commerce, kind of mechanisms that are quite similar across different services. So you kind of know that you're coming to a newspaper. I want to exercise my right to be forgotten. Click. I'm coming to my transport planner. I want to download my data and start using another service instead, based on the data that I've got. It works in a similar way across different services. So that's what we mean, that we can exercise these rights quickly and in kind of predictable, standard ways.
Okay, and the last in the BLTs, the last is the S. We need to talk about what the shift is in society, right?
Yeah. So I mean, we need to remember that of course technological innovations happen. We've got the laws. Sometimes they're coming early, sometimes too late. We've got all kinds of new business models, but the societal angle also, like what's the kind of society that we want to live in? What are the implications of the way services work, the way data is collected, the way technologies work? We talk a lot about, let's say, AI or face recognition or smart cities becoming actually surveillance cities, like in the case of Toronto. There's a lot of debate about that, what's right to do. Just because something's legally okay, it's technologically feasible, and there might be a business case, that still doesn't make it necessarily into something that we really want. So that societal discussion is absolutely essential bit. And since I touched on the cities, just want to mention that, for example, in Europe, the city of Helsinki has committed to the MyData principles, and Barcelona, Amsterdam, many others doing great work in different ways, not just with the kind of MyData principles, but in general, giving their citizens, giving their residents the rights, and at the same time, when you're giving, doing the right thing and giving people the rights, you're possibly allowing for new types of interesting services that, for example, lessen your administrative burden. But yeah, the societal angle definitely one that could be forgotten if we leave it just to the technologists.
Now, is that the hardest part?
Great question. I think all the bits are difficult. Probably the societal angles are tricky in the sense that, of course, again, talking globally, we've got different cultures, different, what's right is from my point of view, is probably slightly different from what's right or what's desired from your point of view. So, I mean, in that sense, there's definitely a lot of kind of maybe battleground is not the right word, but let's say place for debate. And for example, in Europe, we talk now about the kind of a third way. In China, you have a state surveillance in many ways. In terms of the big tech, and there's a lot of talk about the surveillance capitalism. Well, is there a third way, a human-centric way that perhaps is driven by European values or largely European values? Perhaps, but this is the discussion that we absolutely need to have.
Yeah, I can see that being a whole, like you say, setting up for quite a bit of debate across how people think and etc. But so all of this we're talking about, what there needs to be, everybody needs to get involved, right? You say people need to act. So what can people do?
Well, yeah, indeed, it's a matter of us as individuals, but also us in our companies and governments and in our various positions to act on. Some of the great hack people, for example, have got their own actions. Paul Olivier Dehaye and personaldata.io helps people get control over their personal data. Brittany Kaiser has her initiative. Follow and support these people. You might not always agree 100% with them, but I think definitely going in the right direction. Similarly, the MyData community welcomes different types of organizations and people from across the world. But there are other good ones as well. It's not just about joining us either. The responsible companies, the responsible actors need to unite and work together to do something like what's happened with, let's say, organic and fair trade, for example, which used to be fringe hippie movements, and now they're part of the business and key selling points. So companies need to think about turning kind of data ethics and giving users control into a competitive advantage. And in terms of what's happening right now, of course, I couldn't be without mentioning that just at the end of September, we're having the fourth MyData conference in Helsinki, which features about 120 or so speakers and about 800 to 1,000 people. If you can make it there, welcome. If not, much of the content will be available online. Join MyData Global if you feel for it and have a look and be curious.
Yeah, so let's pull up that slide, the event, and talk to us just a teeny bit more about what people should expect at that event, like the people that are going to be there, the content. What are some details that people might be interested in?
Okay, sure. Thanks. So end of September, so September 25th, 27th, that's 3 days of pretty intense action if the last year's conferences have been any kind of indicator there. So about 120 different speakers, so very kind of decentralized and broken down, not so couple of stars driven, but rather really kind of action oriented conference. Looking at the world of personal data again from the angles that we discussed, so from the business, legal, tech, and society angles. Lots of interesting discussions, on health, on smart cities, on AI, on digital identities, on the infrastructural needs like the data operators, and topics like this. That what is it? How do we make this shift actually happen?
Great.
And maybe just a comment on right now Finland is chairing the EU, and the human-centric approach to personal data among the topics that is being promoted. So right now is a time that we, the community, can also put some are in a position that we can put some political power into the game as well, and hopefully force our politicians to act on this as well, not just in Europe either, but also outside of Europe.
Yeah, so IDCA, by the way, is a proud member. We're happy to join you guys, and hopefully we'll get to the event as well. In fact, I know we'll be at the event. Looking forward to that. That should be really interesting. I have 3 minutes left, and I would like to give you a chance to leave the audience with some final thoughts. What do you have? Do you have anything else to add to today's discussion? Sounds like we need another discussion too, though. I think we need part 2 of this because we just kind of skimmed the surface.
Well, it's definitely always a skim, and feels like a ton is left unsaid. And yeah, I mean, I think one interesting thing that we really didn't get to. I mean, we talked a little bit about few of the domains and where personal data is interesting. What we didn't talk about very much, maybe leave that for the next session, is the kind of global perspectives, how things look different in Tokyo or San Francisco or in Cameroon, for example, and what the world looks like from that. And I would not claim to know that. So perhaps somebody else with those perspectives can elaborate on those a little bit if that's of interest. And yeah, I mean, it's a big ask, this shift, and like you're asking that, is it really possible? But there was a time when seat belts weren't really worn, and there was a time when you really couldn't consider that smoking would be prohibited on airplanes. So I mean, things do change, and luckily they do. So I mean, yeah, you need a little bit of the facts, and then you need a little bit of faith and a heck of a lot of collaboration to make this change happen.
Great stuff. It's all very exciting, and yeah, and I'm sure that a lot of people are going to be writing in with questions. So if you have any questions, you can reach Teemu or myself. You can come on to idca.com, start the discussion there. I know Teemu is going to maybe start a discussion on IDCA as well. I know you guys have your own thing going, but it would be great to get you guys on IDCA.
Just signed up on that, so looking forward to engaging and discussing further.
Right, absolutely, and that's again, that's www.idca.com. You can find Teemu at MyData.org. He's all over the internet. He's what is it? Tell him your Twitter handle and all that stuff. I don't know it by heart yet.
Yeah, so that's so that's like my Troppone, Troppone, old school Unix 8 character limit from the time when yeah, definitely before the time of personal data and my data.
Yeah, we're dating ourselves here, Teemu. But so if you have any questions, please feel free to give us a shout. It's free to create a basic account on IDCA, encrypted chat, collaboration, built-in storage, ad-free and completely private, and your data is always your own. So Teemu, thank you so much. It was a real pleasure having you here today. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. Teemu, I'm going to see you again. I'm going to make you come back and join us. So you're not done yet. Thanks for
Sounds good. Sounds good. Thanks for having, and thanks to IDCA for hosting this. Absolutely fabulous. Have a great week.
All right. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. Have a pleasant rest of the day or night, wherever you are in the world. And we'll see you again next time on Good Tech.